All right, good morning. Wait, is it still morning? Yes, good morning. Thank you all for being here for our second workshop focused on community resilience. This is the second of 3 today, and really we're excited how this one builds on the one that we just had this morning around resilience hubs, and really a rich and robust conversation around this idea of like community-based organizations and their role, not just in post-disaster, but long-term resilience and recovery for a community. So we're excited to dive a little bit deeper on some of that. It's framed a little bit around arts and culture, so we're going to adjust it a little bit to kind of look at the whole sector of the nonprofit sector. But arts and culture generally plays a critical role in post-disaster response, but they often don't have the same mechanisms or staffing or capacity that traditional direct social service nonprofits do. So just wanted to frame, there will be a little bit broader conversation in this workshop as well. So we're going to spend a couple hours together. This is being streamed live and recorded, so you all have microphones in front of you. So when you speak, please speak into the microphone, push the button to make it from red to green, so people participating virtually can hear. We have branch members up here around the U table, and then we have a couple panelists here in person, and then at least one on Zoom. Branch members, you get to engage with the panelists throughout the conversation. We'll have a facilitated dialogue around this topic. And then branch members that are attending via Zoom, please drop your questions in chat. We'll be monitoring those to make sure those get to the panelists and to the rest of the branch members to sort of share and have dialogue around those questions. The other thing I would say is, when we think about resilience and the conversation we're having today and the workshops we've had previously in the week, the conversation is about resilience every day, not just resilience as a result and post-disaster. So we want to take that, maybe that hurricane hat off for a second, even though we're in hurricane season again, but really think about the long-term resilience of Lee County and those solutions and strategies that we want to get there. We're also driving towards solutions. And so today's conversation is really to get to this idea of understanding what are the solutions, what are the tactics that we can put into this plan for solutions. So before we go much further, I'm going to introduce myself, and then we'll have the panelists introduce themselves, and we'll get the party started. So my name is John Romine. I'm part of the support team for the Recovery Task Force. I'm also part of the team here at Collaboratory.
Hey everyone, my name is Lee Mayfield. I work for Haggerty Consulting. I'm our director of response. My day job is to support our emergency response staff augmentation projects across the country. And every so often, excuse me, I get to support facilitation efforts like this. My background quickly is I worked for Lee County and in the Southwest Florida area for about 14 years. I was director of public safety and emergency management until right after the vaccine rollout, give or take, and then moved on to Haggerty. I've been a part of a lot of the emergency response preparedness recovery actions over the past 14 or so years in Southwest Florida. And I'm excited about the group we have today. The morning session went great, in my opinion. And the people in the room here have solutions. And I think there was a great discussion and dialogue this morning about what we do really well now, and a great respectful conversation about what we can add to that and build for the future. So whether it's arts, cultural institutions, non-governmental organizations, and how they fit into the picture, I think we'll have a great 2-hour conversation here, and looking forward to it. Thanks.
Roger.
Good afternoon or good morning. Roger Mercado with Lee County Human and Veteran Services.
Celeste Fournier with Lee County Emergency Management.
I'm Tessa Lesage. I work here at Collaboratory, and I'm happy to be supporting facilitation today.
And then we have one panelist on Zoom. If you could come off mute and introduce yourself.
Good morning. I'm Charmaine Lopez with Humana Healthy Horizons. I'm the Community Marketing Engagement Specialist. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you. And to the panelists, thank you for being here, and to the branch members, thank you for your commitment this week and, during branch week and in between those meetings to really support the long-term resilience of Lee County. It's important and it means a lot. And so we're going to do a brief overview of what the Recovery Task Force is and what we're trying to accomplish. All right, so the Recovery Task Force is based on the FEMA framework for disaster response, and so this happens in communities across the country after a disaster, whether it's a hurricane, a fire, tornadoes, whatever it might be. And in Lee County, this Recovery Task Force came out of the Lee County Commission, and so the Board of County Commissioners, Commissioner Kevin Ruane is the chair of the Recovery Task Force, and then the remaining 12 members are representative of the elected entities across the county. So you see the municipalities, law enforcement, the fire districts, the school board, the health, Lee Health, legislative delegation, and then our representative from our constitutional officers. The task force is broken into these 8 branches. So we have planning and capacity, economic recovery, education and workforce, health and social services, which is a lot of the conversation we're having today, infrastructure, housing, natural resources, and cultural resources, which is, sort of cross-thread through the last couple of days. And these branches meet on a monthly basis. And so they meet here at Collaboratory. They are public meetings. And this is really where the branches have been starting to identify what are some of those initial priority areas and what are some of the solutions for long-term resilience for our community, specifically Lee County. And so that's what they've been up to for the past 3 months. There is public comment at the end of that meeting, same for this meeting. So as we get through this 2-hour workshop, at the very end, we will have an opportunity for the public that is in attendance to provide any input that they have for consideration. So this is where we are. We are on a bit of an aggressive timeline. We started late February, early March, really focused on driving towards a December 5th date where a recovery and resilience plan will be voted on by the Board of County Commissioners. And that really will be sort of a culmination of all of the work that's happening since early March through really mid-September, where the branches will finalize their work. And so an important piece of this is a robust community effort. So the branches are made up of members of the community. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on the community engagement that we just closed out a couple weeks ago across the entire county. And that effort and what's happened over the last 3 months has really been starting to gather all of the information from technical experts, from the branches, from local municipalities, from Lee County government staff, to really start to understand where we kind of need to organize around to prioritize. And so that's been an important part of the puzzle. We had 17 town halls across the entire county. 2 of them were virtual. They were offered in multiple languages in order to make sure that we had the opportunity for all of our community to participate. Related to the town halls, we had about a little over 1,000 folks participate in person in those town halls or on the 2 virtual ones. And we've had 4,900 surveys completed on resilientlee.com. And if you haven't taken the survey, if you haven't filled it out, it's still open. Please do so. That's how we're also starting to organize some of the community input priorities and making sure we're focusing on the right things, because this is the community's plan. And we want to make sure that shows up in how these initiatives and priorities are identified. Lastly, March 30th, there was a region-wide, so including 4 other counties, Henry, Glades, Charlotte, and Collier, on the table conversations. About 4,000 folks participated in that on one day. Really, again, the same idea of what are the things that we need to prioritize as a community? What are the things that people want to help solve around the region? And so there were a little over 1,000 folks filled out information related to that. That also ties into the community engagement effort for this plan that we're developing. And so this week has been all about workshops. We started on Monday. So again, thank you for being here, both for the branch members, the panelists, and the public. This is really important. This is a piece of step along the way of how we get additional information from subject matter experts on a topic area to really inform the branches. So Monday was 100% focused on critical infrastructure. And I forgot to say this in the first workshop, but we did not have the power conversation on Monday. That will be on June 21st. Between 2 and 5 at 2 o'clock. Thanks, Robbie. 2 o'clock here at Collaboratory. And so that'll be focused on how do we make our power infrastructure more resilient for the long term. And so that one will happen here. And then yesterday we spent the day talking about supporting business and workforce. Today's all about community resilience. And then tomorrow is all about housing. So, and we recognize, and it's already been identified, that all of these are actually connected. And so what's important is getting a little bit drilled down into what are some of the initiatives based on the topic areas, and then sorting and organizing where they actually belong and who will ultimately be the implementer or the owner once it happens. And so today's about solutions. Our hope is that whether it's around how the arts and culture community plays a role in a resilient community, but also the nonprofit sector as a whole plays a role in how we can get to some of those solutions that can be built into this resiliency plan. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lee to open up the conversation. So we'll have a facilitated conversation by Tessa and Lee to really understand what the role of the nonprofit sector and arts and culture community have for a more resilient Lee County.
Thanks, John. Yeah, like we talked about, I think there's some traditional nonprofit partners who are well ingrained in the emergency management process. Salvation Army, Red Cross, a lot of great groups out there that do incredible work. But there are also organizations in our community that support day to day that may not be as plugged in. And I think that's one thing we wanted to talk about. And I think we can frame this in a couple different ways, specific to arts and cultural institutions. I think maybe that's the first question I'll pose to the group. We look at emergency management across preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. And I think there are roles there for different agencies, and some fit more into some boxes and some fit better into other boxes. So I think maybe the first question, just to kick us off, specific to the arts and cultural conversation, and then we can move into a broader conversation on nonprofits as well. But from a how you plug in perspective, the question for the group is, where do we see the arts and cultural institutions, these nonprofits in our community, where do they fit in when it comes to disaster response, recovery, preparedness? Are they the ones on the front lines right after a disaster, or are they more on the preparedness side, or both? So I'll throw that out just as a posed question to the group.
Panel, any thoughts?
And I know this is an area we haven't, just going back to my time in Lee County, I know we worked with a number of them on what we referred to in the last session as blue sky days, when it's not raining and the wind's not blowing. But, I'm just thinking like the Edison Estate, from a preparedness perspective, any of these arts and cultural institutions in our community, just curious what you guys think, where they fit in this whole process generally.
So speaking from the perspective of emergency management, the question is, what do you bring to the table in support of the emergency, or on the preparedness side, as far as resources, whether that is individuals, staff that can be contributed to the event or to the preparedness side of it? Or is it a resource? Like, do you have donations or things like that you're able to contribute into that? Or is it even locations? Do you have facilities, even parking lots that can be added into the resource gambit that we would be using in the response to a disaster? So I think we would have to learn more about individually what each of you brings to the table as far as what you're able to provide and the community assistance, and how you can reach out to the community to figure where you fit in with the overall program.
And how about from a building, and this is maybe a question for anyone who wants to weigh in, from a building capacity standpoint, if there's an arts and cultural institution that, may be in a flood zone or a storm surge zone, what are some ways they can plug in or should be involved in this conversation, so they're not just having to deal with the event when it happens? I'm just curious what thoughts are there on what their role could be, even from a mitigation perspective, to harden their facility or to have a plan in place to take care of the resources that they have that are key to the community.
Roger, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there needs to be probably a more organized and formalized plan to include those folks from the get-go. From our perspective, when we work with our nonprofits, a lot of it is kind of surveying of their assets, and more importantly with the arts community. And I'll just reflect a little bit back on Ian, and because everyone looks at, food distribution, tarp distribution, where can people mobilize and park cars? Where can people spend the night? Where can trailers be put up? But when you look at the building perspective of it, there are a lot of folks in our community who have to get back to work for recovery. And if the school system is closed down, then what happens with all the staff and their families and their children? And so part of, I think, the more formalized conversation, I think, with some of the arts community is from a facility standpoint, that if we've got some nonprofits that typically provide after school care or summer care, but their buildings are not accessible, then how do we tap into that larger network of the arts community with all the assets they have and kind of repurpose their building post-disaster for other activities other than disaster related? The big thing that we struggled with right after Ian is, how do we get our department back to work? And if the schools are closed, what do we do with our staff? And so for a number of days, staff have the ability to bring their kids in the workplace, but we know not everybody has that flexibility. So in speaking with some of our nonprofits, they were at the ready to provide those different services. But if their buildings were damaged, then we were going to be struggling to try to find some other resources. So I think from a facilities and building standpoint, I think we need to look a little differently at the arts community of not the recovery aspect of where can we bring water, where can we bring ice, but as a service option for a physical space for a lot of the things that happen post disaster.
That's such a great point. And this morning we were talking about resilience hubs and talking about how do we fortify, nodes or places in the community where people are already going, they get other things, and then how can they be more readied? And one of the things we did not have on our inventory was this idea of like, how do we get people back to work, or how do we get people mobilized if the schools are closed? And it's a really great idea. And I just want to mention that the Lee County Action Team for Future Makers, which is basically run out of the school district, is working on identifying how nonprofits can play a bigger role in before and after school care. And I think that maybe there's some synergy here, because if we're doing it on a regular basis, then it's not going to be as big of a deal when we turn around in response to a disaster. The issue though is, how do you fund it? How do you make sure that those buildings are ready? How do we make sure that they're an actual true asset in the recovery plan? So I don't know if, and I think Roger, you can probably speak to this as well, but nonprofits typically are, not flush with cash. And so we have to figure out, how do we invest in those nonprofit organizations as more than just the service that they provide on a day-to-day basis?
And that's a great point. And this is a conversation, I think, not specifically Lee County government as a funder of many partner agencies, but anyone who funds agencies, is what's the structure of your funding capacity? Everybody wants to pay for staff and have program outcomes, but there has to be some conversations about the intangibles and the overhead space and building capacity, not only for staff, but also for physical infrastructure. Nobody likes to pay for a light bill. Nobody wants to pay for Wi-Fi from a funder standpoint, but all those things are necessary as part of the recovery if we're going to lean on those nonprofits to do a little bit more when we ask them. So I think from the get-go, funders have to look a little bit at how they fund programs. And I get it. Folks that donate don't necessarily want to pay someone's electric bill. They want to pay for an after-school slot to make sure that child is achieving in school. But if that agency doesn't have insurance and liability insurance, and the lights aren't on and there's no Wi-Fi, then all those programs are not going to do any good. And so as a community and as a funder, we need to look at different ways to fund the agencies pre-storm and post-storm to ensure that they're available for us when we need them, because they are the backbone of a lot of the work that we do.
Roger, when you guys are funding these agencies, like within the United Way, there's almost a rating system that if they engage with multiple collaborative nonprofits, we trust them more, we engage with them more because we know that it has a multiplying effect. Is that part of your underwrite on how you fund and choose the organizations?
We have gone through some evolution over the last probably 5 years of how we fund agencies, and we want to become more program-based or program outcome-based, but we also have the appetite to figure out how do we fund some of those things that most folks don't fund. And we look at partnerships and we look at relationships and how do you leverage those things. And so there's actually been some conversations even before COVID with some of the major funders in our community of, should we have a universal application? So all these nonprofits are hustling to apply for funding, and they're spending a week to 10 days on our application. Then they're going to spend a week to 10 days on United Way's application. And if they get money from the city of Cape Coral or from another funder, they're spending all this time and energy. And we know for those smaller nonprofits, that CEO is the director of HR, the director of development, the director of custodial work. And so everything that we do, we need to be more intentional because we know the answer. We just need, as a community, to come together to figure out what that looks like. And so we've had conversations about a universal application so the agencies can do the work that they do. And we as funders can feel confident that, one, we're not duplicating efforts, but two, we're actually providing a service that we know is necessary.
So in the planning side, to push back to that, and this is, I'm going to drop my mixed use comment early. Yeah, I did forget it in the first one. Sorry. Creating proximity and planning for access for those same type of ideas is, hey, if we have universal applications, what if we have easier access to transportation and multimodal points of contact? And so encouraging, or creating flexibility or ease of development for those agencies when they come proximate to each other, I guess is just an ask, because we know that there's efficiencies in scale when that comes.
And great question. And I'll take it from the human service lens, maybe not the planning and community development lens for that portion of it. But that was one of the things. And I know when I walked in, Jen Hagan made a comment earlier, and you may have had this as an earlier topic. A lot of the work that we did in early 2000 was community organization. We work with target neighborhoods, either built community centers or rehabbed community centers to be that central point of location. So people don't have to leave their neighborhood, whether it's because of lack of transportation or, no offense to Lee-Tran, and I know they're making great strides, but the time that you're on a bus sometimes makes it difficult to get to an appointment on time, seek employment. So we created these neighborhood community centers through a program called Neighborhood Building, where with the target neighborhoods based on census information, we invested some CDBG dollars into creating those neighborhood community centers with the idea that other nonprofits would come to those centers. And so, perfect example, Suncoast Estates, we physically built that community center, where in Pine Manor, we had a home rezoned and then rehabbed to be a community center. So we had dollars at the time to reinvest in those neighborhoods. One of the things as a county we're looking at now, and we did this in North Fort Myers with the new library, is we asked for part of the design to include an outreach office. And so we know there's certain areas that people access in our community because of the type of service they deliver. Libraries being one of them. There's air conditioning, there's Wi-Fi's, parks and rec centers, the same thing. There's access to showers. So with the North Fort Myers Library pre-construction, we asked county administration to put an outreach office in there, not only for our office to do services and programs, but for the rest of the community. And so we have folks that are constantly rotating out of that office in North Fort Myers in the library for those folks that can't leave North Fort Myers and get to downtown, or have only a bike and it's an easier ride to the library than it would be to get downtown over the bridge. And so we have made some strides in doing some of that with even the county facilities, and continued to look at ways of improving that with the facilities that we own and operate.
If I may, following up tangentially on the transportation question, but also relating back to the childcare needs. We had line of sight to not only destruction of buildings or, not able, you have delays because you don't have a facility. But there were also certain facilities that could have been used, but there were staffing issues because the staff had individual needs that needed to be met first. So is there, just as we try to rethink how we, like the paradigm of transportation, instead of how many cars can we fit on the road, how are we moving people? Is there, I think there's potential, but is there a pathway to rethink staffing as an asset under particular circumstances?
I think so. And Celeste may be able to add some of this from emergency management standpoint of staffing shelters and how they do that with county staff. But I think one of the things that we did quickly after Ian is reached out to our nonprofits and kind of surveyed them of where is their capacity? Do they have a facility that's operational, but they don't have staff to run it? Or do they have staff available, but they can't go back to the facility, and how do we repurpose those folks? But I think this was a great learning opportunity for us to determine that we need a better structure in place and a more formalized structure in place to be able to tap into those folks. Because we know, same as our department, like everybody else in this room, you tried to continue to offer services and have your business open, but you had coworkers who were impacted by this, that we always say family first. Take care of your family and your needs, and then come back to the office. And so we should probably look at a different way. And the county has done that with a particular program called E-Roll and tapping into the staff. But as a larger community, how do we, and I know this is a conversation we have with United Way all the time, especially after disaster. All these folks come in from out of the area and they want to help. And what is the best way to funnel those folks into one, if they want to, one system that they can be deployed out in the community? I know United Way does a great job with their volunteer center and the emergency management when they've got staff out there to stand up services. When people call in, they are deploying people to different parts of the community, but there should be probably more intentional conversation of not only building assets, but human capital, and how do we leverage that?
Yes,
I have a question before we go. I'm hearing the arts and cultural facilities, nonprofits. Why don't I hear anything about faith-based organization churches? Because they came to me. Most of us in here been here for a few years, know Israel Suarez. Israel Suarez oversees over 40-some churches. They came to me because they couldn't get a hold of anybody in the county and city. They said they got these buildings all over the place. And my brothers are in alliance with 20-some different faiths here in Lee County. They all have an alliance together, and they say, well, hey, they come to me. So I try to reach out to people, but nobody would respond about it. And these people have buildings, they got the space, they're in all communities, they're everywhere, they're easier to reach for some people because they're right in their community. Language wouldn't be an issue because they have the different churches in the communities where the people speak the language is. They also, most of them have transportation. They got vans, they got buses. I'm just saying, the only issue most of them will have, just like you said about regular nonprofits, which I'm associated with as well. They don't have the money to afford to run their facilities every day, but they got the rooms, they got the space, they got the property. Most of them have more property than anybody else in their communities. So if you need camping people to camp on their land, as long as you cover the cost of that, they don't have any problem. I'm just asking the question.
That's a great question, and it kind of feeds into what we spoke about this morning. And Celeste, go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to let you know that through emergency management, we have established a faith-based organization group that was in action during Ian. And I can provide you the contact information for the individual in our office that works with the United Way, because it is organized through a collaboration between emergency management and the United Way program. And so I can get you looped in, and then because they are always looking for more individuals to join this group. And so during Ian, they were helping us in the volunteer and donations branch for Ian. So there is an inlet for you, and I'm happy to provide you the contact information for that.
And I think just to zoom out a little bit, the purpose of this discussion today is to talk through what I think, one, we do a lot of stuff really well in Lee County, but what else can we do, to your point, to add to that? We talked a lot this morning about how do we invest in nonprofits, whether they're faith-based or otherwise, during regular times, which is 99% of the day here, right? Or the year. And then how does that add value during a disaster and after? You can't go to a faith-based organization after hurricane landfall and you've never met them before. You don't know who they are. You don't know what the process is. You have to build that beforehand. So I think maybe a question is, just looking at nonprofits in general, I would include faith-based groups there. What are some things we can do now? Or in a perfect world, if you guys had a wish list of resources, funding, staffing, hardening of your facility, what are some things that we can do now to grow capability that will, one, help on a regular day, which is most of the time, and two, at the same time would feed into their involvement after a large scale disaster. So I think that's maybe the broad-based question for non-governmental organizations in general, of which we have many that do great work in Lee County. What do they need? What can be useful now as we build out kind of a wish list of actions that will support day-to-day use in these neighborhoods and also, after disasters.
Let me just add to Lee's comment, because faith-based was on my radar to talk about this morning, because we had staff even before COVID reach out to well over 300 churches to get their contact information. And so we have created a spreadsheet database, if you will, that emergency management has tapped into, because we leaned on them during COVID. We reached out to the faith-based community and said, we would love you to be testing sites. What does your parking look like? What does your staffing look like? So we have leaned on the faith-based community in the past, even in a different hat of homelessness. There are a lot of faith-based providers that are part of the Lee County Homeless Coalition that do a lot of work and a lot of great services. Sometimes engagement, and Therese can probably speak to this with her former position, but sometimes the faith-based does not want to engage with the government for many reasons. And so we have made some efforts and had some strides with some of the community, but sometimes we need some of the nonprofits to help mobilize folks for a couple different reasons.
Well, I can attest to that because they don't want the government in their money. So the point is, see, that's the bottom line of all this, because they don't want you in their money. But there are ways that you can engage with them without them having any concerns or fear of that.
100%.
And I think that would be a very good step to do all that now when there is nothing, and do all that pre-qualifying location, property, land, what could be used, all that kind of stuff up front. Because I'm telling you, if you engage just between Israel's group and the alliance that my brother's a part of here in Lee County, and now these are all different faiths, from Jewish, Catholic, I mean, all of them are part of this. Between these two organizations alone, I mean, you'll cover a community very good. You have a good fit with the other nonprofit organizations that's out there.
So one of the things in blue skies, if you will, with our office, we're part of the continuum of care, working with all the different nonprofits that work with individuals and families that are experiencing homelessness. And so my first introduction to Lee, when he was with emergency management with Lee County years ago, was at a position I was in with a nonprofit. We created a severe weather outreach plan. And if the temperatures were projected to drop below 40 degrees or lower, we mobilize volunteers in the community to engage with individuals that are experiencing homelessness, provide them coffee, provide them a blanket, but then ask them if they want to get into shelter. And if they did, we could provide transportation for them. So we've expanded that over the years, now having it within Lee County government, and also do that during storm warnings and tornado watches and hurricane times. And so one of the things that we asked our new director with the Homeless Coalition is to engage the faith-based community and build that network during those winter months to be shelter, work it out in those smaller months, that if we need a bigger playbook after Ian, then volunteers have been trained. They've been provided the different necessities, whether it's blankets, water, rations. So there is a movement to try to engage the faith-based community at a much larger scale. I think this storm, to Lee's point, showed us what maybe our community is really good at doing, but it also showed some of the gaps that this group now is trying to plug in and fill. So I think it's a great conversation and great opportunity to engage those folks that traditionally haven't been.
If I could comment on that, because you did bring me into the conversation.
Sorry.
So that's okay. So to your point and to Lee's point, certain churches are more engaged than others, and this is great work that the Homeless Coalition is continuing to do. It is an untapped resource. So yes, it is happening, and I'm confident that Michael will continue moving that forward at the coalition. My question is, the question was, as a nonprofit, what is the need? What do we see as the most relevant need right now? And this meeting is a little different than the previous one. This one is focused on disaster recovery from what I'm reading here in the question here. So for me, now with a nonprofit housing corporation that houses very vulnerable people, we need to get our schools back up and running, and people were staying in shelter. We moved our homeless post-Ian several times because there really wasn't a lot of strategy around that. If there was some type of funding for resiliency for nonprofits, whether you're a housing nonprofit or maybe you're not, maybe you're an arts that could shelter people, long-term transition to be a transitional living space and harden those facilities, and they could be flex spaces during the storm and the disaster recovery stage. And Roger, my question for this workshop is, Lee County receives so much funding that has so much regulation around it. What bucket of money, percentage-wise, don't mean to put you on the spot, do you even have flexibility to do something? Because the vast amount of money, Dan, you know this, it's ship, it's sail, it's home, CDBG, all those things. Is there flexibility, or is this going to have to come from places like the collaboratory and through philanthropy?
I think there's, and that's a great question, because out of our office, at least, we distribute general fund dollars, state dollars, and federal dollars. And many of those have eligibility requirements. And so the dollars that are coming in our community from the CDBG DR are going to have the same kind of strings attached. However, there's a bunch of different eligible categories that you could try to not fit a square peg into a round hole, but the categories are broad enough that you could find some eligibility categories in there. The caveat of that is a certain percentage has to be working with low and moderate communities. And that's going to be the challenge, I think, and this is no offense to the process to date. Many folks are coming to the town hall meetings. Lee County is going to have to do at least 1 or 2 public workshops to get information from the community based on what HUD requires. Some of the needs that are expressed may not fit into the bucket of CDBG DR, which might be the challenge. And so I think there is some flexibility, and some things are pretty black and white. But if you look at the eligible categories, like the things that we did in the neighborhoods, that's all kind of under the umbrella of public services. And so that is a category that could be used working with our nonprofits under public services. So everything obviously has to be tied to the disaster. And so there will be opportunities for nonprofits to, once a NOFA, a notice of funding availability, is posted after this process the county is going to go through for the CDBG DR, there'll be opportunities for all these nonprofits to apply for funding. It's tied to the hurricane, but tied to a category, and public services is a pretty broad category that they might be able to fall under.
Thank you.
I know we turned the corner there. Nonprofits, there's so many different buckets of nonprofits in our community, whether it's the housing, like we mentioned. I want to pivot to healthcare and social services. Charlene, I know you're on the line. I'm curious your perspective on this when it comes to maybe nonprofits that support in healthcare and social services. Are there any kind of key things on your mind that you're thinking, how these nonprofits or NGOs can engage both day to day and after a disaster when it comes to disaster recovery on the healthcare side?
Well, I can definitely say that Humana Healthy Horizons, we worked closely with our enrolled Medicaid enrollees to get them the services that they need. We work closely with nonprofits mainly. We work with faith-based organizations as well to get them housing, help them with housing, furniture, clothing, basic needs that they may need, food, whether it was shelter, transportation. These are things that we're actively doing and engaged more so with our members after Hurricane Ian in the regions that were affected, and specifically here in Southwest Florida. So with the need of a car, a lot of, as we know, a lot of homes have been destroyed, or still, their roofs are still under repair. So as you're saying all of these things, I'm thinking shelter for the art facilities. Could we possibly be storing food, working with Harry Chapin to have food banks available, pre and post disaster available to people, or they can, get clothing. I know during that time, we also collected a lot of blankets for those that were in shelters. So what could we be doing before disaster comes, and knowing that we're preparing for storms, so that we have these things in reserve for those who may need them?
Sure. No, that's very helpful. Maria, go ahead.
I wanted to go back to specifically arts and culture and even the faith-based when we're talking about what we can be doing right now, and possibly introducing them to be a little bit more formal part of disaster relief. I know for our community, the building that fared the best was actually an arts building, was Big Arts, and that has become sort of the hub where you can get information out to people, and it really served the island well. They did all of this without having to think about some sort of funding for their overhead. So they were opening up the community for town halls and the different things that we're having to do. So I think addressing some sort of stabilized funding, they lost their season. All these museums, all these groups, they're not doing their shows, they're not doing their usual fundraising capabilities because they're not necessarily serving the community exactly how my organization is, which is directly helping survivors. So I think it's important to address that funding concern for all of those, and also bring them into a big aspect of the mental health. They provide a sense of normality for our communities, both the faith-based and the arts and culture. And a lot of times when we're trying to address mental health in certain older populations or ones where it's sort of a stigma, the best way to destigmatize that is engage with arts and culture, faith, and start addressing those needs at that level versus at a social service, traditional nonprofit.
So in all transparency, there was a couple of us that spent last night with City Council, Cape Coral City Council, discussing the value of the yacht club. And this is a hot topic, but when we're talking about arts and culture, that was the hub of civic and community engagement in Cape Coral for over 50 years. The conversation now is it's cheaper to demolish and redo it. So the question I have, and of course, I'm very biased on this topic. I grew up at the yacht club and both my grandfathers built it. So I'm being very transparent. But I also want to say that when it comes to arts and culture in our community, we need to recognize the value, which may not be fair market value, but the value in the heart of the community and the impact and the resources and the ability for that community to show up in spaces that otherwise were not there. And so I just wanted to highlight this discussion that's happening across the river with the potential of how do you assess the value in the history in a town that was built around this building to bring people to live the American dream. So I just want to throw that out there. And the another thought I had when we were talking about the infrastructure that Roger was mentioning, and again, in all transparency, we used to work together doing that work. But when you have the availability to work with the arts in a school system, when the kids can't be in the school because it's a shelter, because of something going on, and you have these embedded community resources or partners, that art has the ability to map the visible, to make the invisible visible, and how much of a heartstring, if you get these kids to show through art the importance of Wi-Fi or power or infrastructure, to pull at the heartstrings of the philanthropists, to fund the invisible social infrastructure needed to embed our community. And I'm just going to call out Celeste because I always look back at biomimicry. My master's is in environmental education and she's a beekeeper. So if we could start to talk about within biomimicry, looking at ourselves as a beehive, and a beehive in science is considered a social organism, a superorganism, excuse me. So if we start to look at what we need to do to rebuild our hive with every single each one of those cells, something different, but we're all connected and we can't operate without each other. How can we do that when you have to work together, but I really think that the arts and the culture institutions have to be at the table, because often they are the first ones when you're talking about blighted communities that bring back that community. They are the first people that show up. So let's just recognize their importance in resiliency as advocates, and often the ones that build and illuminate the infrastructure.
So we've gone from hubs to nodes to hives. I think we're making progress. I don't know. Okay,
That's my
so
science part.
along those lines, and sorry if you weren't here this morning to hear the whole, like parlay to that. So, and I don't know if anyone has examples from other places. So Lee, I'm asking this question in case you want to chime in, but are there actions that Lee County should take, or that we should take as a community, not necessarily Lee County government, but in general, to safeguard our cultural institutions and their assets, given the role that they can play on a bigger scale than just what they do day to day, given the impact that they take when we are down for a period of time? What can we do? What can we do to ensure their sustainability?
Yeah, I'll just kind of kick off that conversation. I think, our profession in emergency management's coming a long way there. The cultural, the arts and cultural, that's part of the federal recovery support function. So it's clearly been identified. There are specific, funding processes and structures in place to support them. I think where we need to go is they've always kind of been put in the bucket of mitigation and preparedness. I don't think we've talked a lot about how they play into disaster response and recovery. So we focus on, Edison Estate, or, fill in the Smithsonian, for example. They have an emergency management department that's built towards safeguarding all of those assets for our country. So I think from a arts and cultural standpoint, that's where we focused this conversation on mitigation. How do we fund them to make sure they protect those key assets in our communities and our country? I think where the conversation, one, we need to do that. So there's probably a conversation to be had on how we better support them. One, how do we identify them? That's step one. Who needs to be involved in this conversation? Step two would be, how are we supporting them on preparedness and mitigation to make sure they have a plan to protect their property, their assets, their people? And then I think the conversation we haven't really had yet much in our profession is, what is their role on the response and recovery side? And that may come into play on facilities and, daycare, and supporting, the community when it comes to post disaster response and recovery. So I think there are a couple steps in that process to include identifying the right people to bring to the table, but really diving in. And this is maybe where the group can focus on what is their role after a hurricane, or after a power outage, or after or during a pandemic. That's where we haven't really dove in yet on arts and cultural, in my opinion.
So this leads me to think about the third space, right? So the first space is where we live, right? That's our home. Our second space is our work. And our third space is where we get that community, that sense of community. So to me, that is the arts, culture, and definitely faith community. And I don't know that, as I look around the table, we're touching on some of them. But in our earlier workshop, there was a comment about difficulty connecting to the Haitian community. And oh my goodness, they have so many cultural organizations in Southwest Florida. So, but we don't see them here today. So I think inventorying who they are and getting them into whatever we're calling it, the hive, the node, the hub, and engaging them, because that's where those trusting relationships are. That's where those cultural commonalities lie. That's where you're going to find sustainability. So, and they often are tied to faith communities. I know I did a little bit of work with Roger when the Afghan families came, and our local mosque was key to the success of working through many of those barriers. So, yeah, I'll just leave that there.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? I'm Frank Bonafili. I'm Economic Recovery Branch, and I had a question. I think the dialogue is wonderful, but we're kind of at a planning phase, and I think we can look at examples that are being used maybe in other industries or other places in the country. Everybody's familiar with 9/11 and how we weren't prepared for that, but how all the industries had to prepare themselves afterwards. An annual check or an annual test by all these different groups that we're talking about, I think is something certainly that isn't a very cost prohibitive. But if we can target where we're going, whether it's a faith-based organization and we have parameters on where they can go, or it's a cultural building, and we're running those tests and we're setting some criteria that if the disaster happens, or shall I say, when the disaster happens, we've tested the bus routes, we've tested the infrastructure, we've tested the AC. We know that we can get food there. By running these tests on an annual or a semi-annual basis before those hurricanes, that's how industry runs today and has been very successful on that. So I wanted to bring that as something maybe on a business side as we look at kind of how do we support and not just the community, but these cultural assets that really are part of the community or the core of the community. So I wanted to see, are there any tests today that we do for disaster preparedness in some of these cultural institutions?
I can chime in on that, and Celeste and the team do a lot of work year round to prepare, and part of that's exercising and testing and training. I think the first comment there, from my experience, having a plan, you have to almost have a plan before you can test something, right? So that's, we worked, for years, year round to reinforce the need for a plan. And that's, a business continuity plan, a comprehensive emergency management plan, not just at the county level, but down to even, and this sounds, maybe overly prepared, but even at the family level, what's your family disaster preparedness plan? That feeds into what your business plan is, everything from communication to, if you couldn't talk to your employees, what's the process for getting back in touch? Where's your meetup location? Timing for all that. I know Lee County, and really you can just Google, there are a lot of great templates out there for these types of plans. That would include things like, what are we doing from a feeding perspective or transportation, depending on your NGO and how you serve the community. I think you can develop a tailored plan, and then absolutely every year or twice a year, go through a process and just get your employees or your group of stakeholders around the table and talk through scenarios. Take that plan and then, talk through it, we call them tabletop exercises. You can actually do more full-scale exercises to implement some pieces of that plan throughout the year. But that is exactly the way to make sure you're prepared, is to have that plan and to test it.
Sorry, I am from a cultural institution, so I can tell you that part of our planning, once it hits June 1st or before then, is to go through an annual checklist and see where we're at, to make sure that we have the supplies on hand that we need. To make sure that, yes, our generator's working, or yes, our flashlights are working, or things that you don't regularly use throughout the year. And then every storm or every mishap that you have, you keep adding to your checklist, because, we think we have everything. And then lo and behold, something happens. You're like, wow, nobody planned for that. So then it gets added to the next year. But part of the challenge is being such a small organization and having such a small staff is, funding. Do we have the funds to make sure every year that we are actually prepared to cover a Category 5 storm coming into the place? Or, what community partners do we have that can come and help us put those shutters up? Because, it's me, and I also have a home and kids, and, so there's lots of things that you have to plan accordingly. And sometimes storms hit and they hit quick, and you're there until midnight trying to save everything, because that's you're passionate. That's why you're doing what you're doing. So there are plans that are in place, but it's fallible. You can't absolutely prepare for everything. You assume your roof's not going to rip off. Maybe it does. So what does that mean? Plastic on everything. Okay. There are plans that most organizations, especially museums, have specifically for that, but everyone's doing the best they can. And that's the hardest part with these arts and cultural organizations. So to everybody's conversation, we have been asking for a seat at the table so that we can be there beforehand to help be a part of the conversations. So if there is money in the future to harden our buildings, to not only save the history of the area, or maybe even become a place that the community can bring important pieces to, so that they are saved and you're not losing everything on Sanibel because it was in somebody's garage. You know, things that people don't think of. There are collections in private organizations that, you know, it's just hanging in someone's home. So there are lots of opportunities as we move forward to create hardened buildings and make sure that we are fully prepared. But in the meantime, it's just doing the best you can.
If I may, I think within the emergency management structure and certainly within healthcare, I'm sure other industries as well, there are tabletop exercises. There are routine, scheduled tests, if you will. But if I'm understanding you correctly, Frank, what you're pitching is a community-wide effort to test the extended network of response or recovery preparation. And I think what better time to do that than in the month of June?
Sure.
Dr. Martin?
Just a few observations from another life and here. Incidentally, I'm Mike Martin, lame duck of FGCU. A couple observations. I grew up in a place where the only hurricane I ever heard about was Reuben Hurricane Carter, the boxer. But I did lead LSU through Gustav, which was then post-Katrina. And then I came here and had Irma and now Ian. And I will say this, Louisiana was much better prepared than this place was. Maybe Katrina was so powerful that they were forced to. Couple of observations. One is it wasn't county-based, it was region-based. East Baton Rouge Parish helped West Baton Rouge Parish, despite the fact that the Mississippi was in the middle of it, and everyone else did. It magnified the number of resources you could move from a less damaged place to a damaged place. So that was one of the first observations. No one ever said to me, we are only going to talk about East Baton Rouge Parish. Never came up. The other is the community knew much better than here what assets the university had that could help. Let me give you the example here, both through Irma and Katrina, Ian. A handful of people knew we have 5 enormous cement parking garages and they move their cars in and their boats. Only the people who knew that. And so we had a handful. We were glad to take them in if we could, but only a handful of people knew that. Now we did take in, our WGCU took in 2 commercial broadcasters that broadcast out of our facility. They knew each other. But it was all a one-on-one, one-on-two, not a community sense that there are assets here. The other thing after Irma, I went to the county and said, we have 512 acres out in Buckingham doing nothing, right? It needs some cleanup. Why don't we build some large buildings that can be used for summer camps, for 4-H and FFA and a variety of other things, and then be stand ready to go? Because it's never been hit hard by a hurricane. We lost a few trees, but it's high enough that it was safe. And as soon as the disaster seemed to have passed, the conversation ended. And then I thought to myself, you know, if those 5 years ago we would have prepared out there, it would have been the perfect evacuation place for a lot of people because there's nothing out there. Now we do store a lot of stuff. We store a lot of our art out there. There's a big old meat packing plant that's scary as hell. I guarantee you, if you afterwards you want to do a zombie movie, we got the set for you, but we moved a lot of our artwork and other things into that building, but no one else knew we had it. And we didn't quite know how to let other people know we had it. So there is this sense that first of all, somehow the storm knows the boundaries between Collier and Lee and Charlotte and Hendry County, and therefore we only need to worry about what's in those boundaries. And secondly, I don't think there's a broad understanding among any NGOs or anybody else of the assets that can be brought to bear, at least in the short to intermediate term, to help people out, including parking garages. And one of the reasons I think our environment at the campus has held up through 2 hurricanes is the 4 big parking garages take down all the cross current winds through the campus. So we've not had any serious damage because you got these huge pieces of concrete that deflect it all. And so I was just amazed. I was proud of our WCCU people for taking in broadcasters that one might view as competition. But I was amazed at how little requests we got for other stuff. So just an observation.
So thank you for that. Two things, this idea of regionalism, which is critically important. We can pretend like this only happened in Lee County. It happened in other places, but also the effects of it happening in Lee County impacted the places around us. And when people are still up and running, there's value in understanding what your assets are at a regional level. Just like we have to step up when something bad happens in Hendry or other places. So I think that that's a point worth us discussing. I think the other thing that I want to mention though, and what I'm hearing is there needs to be some sort of inventory so that we actually know who we're reaching out to. I'm guessing some nonprofit arts, cultural organizations, faith-based organizations could use a template for how they should be and reminders for how they should be checking and being part of being prepared for a disaster every year. We could do that if we had a comprehensive inventory and sort of understood a little bit more about what exists. My question would be, and by the way, an inventory and assessment can be an initiative that we need to try to pursue as part of this effort. My question would be, who would house that? Or who would be what entity is right to manage that process and then manage that information over time? I mean, other people would have to be involved, right? Because you'd probably want to send out things from the EOC or whatever, and maybe that's but where does that live, that inventory process?
Let me just piggyback a little bit on some of the comments before and then to your comments, Tessa. And so I was making a lot of notes while the conversation was taking place. And so one of the things that we did after Ian was surveyed all the nonprofits. And so we are going to be making an intentional shift in some of our applications to ask that question before a disaster. What do you see your role as pre and post disaster? But one thing that we could add as funders, and so anyone who is part of the conversation of funding agencies is, as part of their application process, submit your emergency management plan.
Yes,
To ensure that they actually have one. So that's a great takeaway from this. And then obviously, Tessa, to piggyback on what you just said, what I wrote was asset mapping for the community, because it's obvious that we have not done a great job of that. And if we did, maybe it's outdated because we know we've got nonprofits and faith-based that pop up all the time. And so from our standpoint, we can work with our NGOs that we work with and share that information with emergency management. But it's going to take the other folks to be able to do the same thing. And so I think obviously lessons learned, as many great things as we're doing, we're realizing all these gaps in our community. And so maybe a larger asset mapping exercise that the collaboratory does or through the Resilient Lee does to come up with a kind of a master plan at the end of all this, but to include asset mapping.
And actually putting it on a map.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like we need GIS layers of
So
this.
we did
Yeah.
discuss that in our branch. And in our branch, we have United Way at the table and Dr. Felke from FGCU. Dr. Felke worked very closely on a GIS mapping on our ad hoc mental health, behavioral health committee that we stood up for a couple of years. And we overlaid United Way 211 data. So the foundation is there, just who takes it? Who does the work? Who updates that mapping?
Right,
It
that is
exists.
something that has to be funded, or it's gonna
Yes.
just be a one in place and time thing that
Yes.
happens and then it means nothing.
And then Jennifer mentioned something about a Ripple report. I mean, I think we're data rich. We
Yeah.
just need to fund something to map it because we're talking a lot about it, but it needs to somehow happen.
There has to be somebody who's thinking about how all of these things connect together. And I think that that's sort of what we've got to land on is like, once we have this, where does it go? Right.
Yeah.
And I do want to get back to the regionalism
That's where
question.
it's going to go next.
Okay.
So regionalism, my current role, now I have a regional position, just 3 counties. I don't know what you consider regional. But when I sit in on these different meetings from Collier, Charlotte, and Lee, obviously this is a Lee event. But if we were talking about Charlie, it would have been a Charlotte event. So to Dr. Martin's point, we need some type of a regional resiliency response because they are our partners that can deploy they're north of us and south of us, and we'll be there for each other. So whatever that looks like, it's definitely, the numbers are night and day when I'm looking at the impact numbers. And then that property in Buckingham. Folks, let's try to come up with something for that.
Mhm.
I've had my eye on that forever. Roger, we've talked about it. Talk about an LMI project, work, live, play. We could get, Lee Tran out there. Don't mean to squelch your idea with emergency response, but that is a huge community asset that has been under leveraged for years.
And it's a bit of an embarrassment, I must say, to me. I mean, I didn't take it in, and I have no idea what Bill Merwin had in mind when he did.
Mhm.
And he's not around to tell me. But my view is, it could serve the community so profoundly if we could come together with a plan that we could actually put in place. The downside is the buildings are all asbestos loaded up, and most of them need to come down.
Mhm.
I do go out to the little chapel and give free sermons. No one else shows up, but it's a wonderful little chapel. It's got one of those huge Bibles I read from, but if you haven't been out there, it's an enormous piece of property. We put a driving range out there so we could keep our accreditation for our professional golf management program. But that only used about 12 of the 500 acres.
Mhm.
And again, it's one of those places that you can escape to, and you have a pretty good chance of avoiding the biggest hit. And the other regional thing that happened to us during Irma is we had, we had about 2,000 people in Lico Arena that were officially evacuated. And then the day of the storm, 3 busloads of high acuity elderly from Punta Gorda showed up. We didn't know they were coming. We put them in our nursing program as an emergency, but at least they knew we were there and we were glad to have them. I did point out to somebody, there's one fellow who was pretty catatonic in a wheelchair, and I was pretty sure it was Axl Rose, but that was just my own observation. But so they knew we were there, or they knew where they could go. And I was asking myself, well, how many other people know or don't know? Because we could have found some ways to accommodate some people, just like with, if you have a theater that can't operate, we have a theater you could operate out of for a while.
So
This is
this is such a great point, because the complex nature of everything that could happen and that does happen and that exists as FGCU as an asset is something that needs to be considered on a very deep level, not just, hey, FGCU is an asset, right? So how do we really dig into the efficiencies we can create when we think differently about how we use space? Dan, did you have something?
I have like 6 answers.
Oh,
So, Dr. Martin, there's a proposal for Lee County School District to combine and execute. And if we can further that conversation, I think there's some unique things that can happen. Roger, we have every single asset pretty much in CoStar, right? And we can set up a separate mechanism of making our notation so that we could access that. And then rather than getting, 27 emails asking about buildings that aren't available after the fact, we could just have those phone calls in advance and set some of those up. So I think there's a community network that's in place that can engage, that might be there. Obviously, my favorite comment from Dr. Martin is that real estate saves lives by blocking wind. and vertical mixed use projects do create safe, strong facilities.
wait, what kind of projects?
Vertical mixed use projects.
Okay, I just want to make sure I heard you. No one's brought that up yet.
No. Yeah, you're incredible. So that's my 6 and 3.
What
And
is CoStar?
CoStar, it's a,
It's a commercial multiple listing services, but it's really a inventory for commercial real estate. It mixes and crosses all categories in real estate. It doesn't do houses. That's the only category.
Like a LoopNet?
It's owned by CoStar owns LoopNet.
Oh.
does the EDO have that? Do you know? I think they might.
I would assume that.
Yeah.
to hit real quick back on the regionalization piece, I think that's important, looking at other functions during disasters. And I think this is maybe a best practice we can have a conversation about implementing in other areas. Fire, EMS, law enforcement work very well regionally together. Something happens in Lee County, you immediately have strike teams and coordinators from Tallahassee to the regional level who know where to deploy teams, how to deploy teams. The Surfside event, I believe, was the largest response of mutual aid teams in Florida ever. We have teams in every region. People that make up these teams come from local first responder agencies. I don't know if that necessarily, that mutual aid regional network, I don't know if that necessarily exists in some of these other functions that we're talking about. So maybe there's some best practices we can
So
learn from our first
modeling
responder
that,
friends, correct?
Modeling that. I mean, some of us, like, it is 100% relationship based. So what Dr. Martin was saying, there's a lot to everything that you said, but if you have the relationship, then you know to ask, right? So after Irma, a few of us went out to Hendry because they struggled a lot after Hendry. They had all these resources. They could not get them out to the community. And that was something that we could do to try to support them. They have received so many people from Lee County because of this storm. They already had a bad housing problem. It's much, much worse now. And so it's impacting them too. We have to think of ways to model this emergency management model on regionalism with some of the other things that we do. Because FGCU is also an asset to Hendry County and to Glades and to Charlotte and to Collier. So we have to look at how those things in a regional way, the assessment, the inventory, and then the agreements and the relationships and understandings that we have need to be expanded, I think, is what I'm hearing.
And there's a funding process for some of that on the first responder side, even state to state mutual aid. So maybe some of that can be modeled across, different sectors in the NGO world as well.
And I'll just add that $1.1 billion, there will be NOFAs posted for nonprofits to apply. And whether that's a conversation the county has specifically with FGCU about the Buckingham project, if the school district project doesn't work out, but there's funding coming. It's just a matter of going through the process now that eventually NOFAs will be posted. And one of the notes I made here, even for funders to consider, is it Janelle? If funders provide a certain percentage of their allocation to the agencies towards disaster preparedness. And so if that is whatever you need prior to or post, that's an allowable expense that maybe wasn't already in the application. And so we can have those conversations internally and with United Way to see if that's an option to designate some dollars specific for that.
And Janelle, I'm curious, just not to have you speak for all people in your sector there, but if funding, if you had funding for certain activities, both to support your day-to-day resiliency and after disasters, are there some things that come to your top 3 things you would utilize that funding for, just to throw some ideas out there?
Well, specifically, so for those of you who don't know me, I am the executive director of the Cape Coral Museum of History. So within the city, we're holding our own sort of conversations of these types of things, and top foremost would really be hardening of our buildings and having that capacity to not only keep our collections safe during disaster, but to also create a secondary space so that maybe we can utilize it during storms or just post storms to maybe have meetings or things like that for emergency management services. But the most challenging thing for us just in general as a nonprofit, of course, is always funding, and capital improvements are very rarely ever funded. So you're always trying, you have so much deferred maintenance and you have issues. And then when a big storm comes, well, you're already behind the 8 ball. So it's very challenging, but if you can get money and look at it as an investment moving forward to be able to house, not only again, keep the best practices and standards and safety of the collection itself, but to also work during, emergency management situations where you become another asset to the community and again, being at that table. But really just in general, it's being a part of the conversation. So that's not necessarily funding or what we could do, but it's remembering we exist and that we also need help, that we are a pertinent part of the community. We do have an economic impact. And to some of these other organizations, especially faith-based, we've had conversations saying, why do we keep reinventing the wheel? Organizations, especially faith-based organizations, they're meant for helping very large amounts of people in a very quick manner. They're already set up to do that. So bringing them to the table beforehand and utilizing them as an asset, as opposed to coming in after the fact and trying to figure out, well, who do I talk to? Who do I call? Or where, who, what, when, where? We've got money or we've got food. We can't find anybody to give it to. Nobody knows we exist.
Yeah.
So it's really being just a big part of it.
We have to recognize the capacity of these organizations too. Like, we have to understand their capacity and adapt how we try to bring them into that capacity as well. Yeah.
I think that's exactly it. Marco Villalobos from Cape Christian Church. And I think capacity is huge, just finding out who your players are. Because when you think of arts and culture, you have museums, you have churches, you have art galleries, and so they're all going to play different roles in when a disaster hits. Whereas a museum, we want to protect some of the art and things and protect those. Whereas a church like Janelle said, which we were together with, hi, by the way, yeah, on our serve day, is really find out like who are the players. You know, I grew up in the 90s, and so I'll use Michael Jordan as an example, the Bulls. It's like, okay, you know, we have a disaster. Am I going to Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, or Michael Jordan? You know, like I'm going to the one who I know is going to execute. And being in Nashville, I was there with the tornadoes, the bombings, the flooding, been here for a year. And one thing I've learned, the Nashville community was awesome when tornadoes hit, the way they got together, but I haven't seen anything of what happened here last year during the hurricane. I mean, there's people who have moved here because they saw the community get together. From what I hear, that is not normal. And one thing I saw at our church with helping the thousands of people a day that we helped was that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what I mean by that is you could have a good plan and a good focus, but it's the culture that's really going to execute that and make that strategy live. And so part of that culture is relationships.
Yeah.
It's getting together. It's getting in rooms like this, becoming friends, you know, so we work together. So like me and Janelle, we work together for a serve day. So guess what? If there's a disaster, I'm calling, hey, Janelle, how are you doing? You know, and it's an ongoing relationship. And some of you guys have been, you know, raised here like Jennifer, so you know everyone, you know, whereas I've been here for a year, I'm still learning everyone.
Sounds
but-
like you've met a lot of people.
Yeah, well, Hurricane will do that when you're an outreach pastor. Yeah, but I think that that's key is just relationships, because until leadership can become friends, then it's hard to work together when you need to.
Yeah, what we see as the result is really a reflection of our relationships. So if our relationships across organizations and with each other are strong and good, the outcomes start to go in the right direction. Where they fall apart is where we have to start to work and figure out those are the gaps, right?
I think we're going to need to do some crosswalking between this morning's workshop and this current workshop, because there's so much more to the discussion beyond what we're talking about here right now. In addition to yesterday's discussion as pertains to bringing notoriety to the region and making certain that there's a shining star at the end that creates not just the resiliency, but that beacon of light and hope. And we can share that with other other regions and communities as well.
If I could. to go
Can I jump in really
back
quick?
to-
Yeah, one thing me and Janelle in the cultural branch that we had, we talked about even art in Lee County, how it's lacking. You know, there's not a lot of creativity art here as compared to other counties like, you know, Collier County and what's the county above us? I'm still Charlotte. And so just how do we build more of a creative culture here? Because, you know, creativity inspires, it encourages, it brings life. You know, and so following a disaster, being able to do the just have some type of something here that's built in to help kind of bring a sense of normality. Like we did a big Christmas event 2 months after the hurricane. We had 40,000 people come through our church within 3 weeks, and it was just a place of normalcy. People coming, playing on the playgrounds, and even during the hurricane, when there's thousands of cars lined up, we have a playground there for the kids. So there's kids playing basketball, but just these parks and places that can be used for multiple things at once. And so I'd like to see just the art culture here in general, beyond disaster relief, day to day, just increase out here as well. So.
Roger, if I may follow up on a workshop earlier, we were talking about, you know, building systems, a resilient system. So any opportunity where we can get buy-in for filling in these gaps. In the grant process, you mentioned that you want to say, what is your resiliency plan? Many of these nonprofits, they want to be at the table during a disaster, but they don't know how to plug in. In the grant process, is there an opportunity to say, maybe you could be just a one-man show or a two-man show. Can we activate you in a disaster, your workforce that's employed by you to help in the immediate response? This is not something new. Lee, this is going back to how the state works in the EOC. I have a healthcare license and I got a call that said, Can we activate you as a respiratory therapist? I haven't practiced in 15 years. You don't want me running your life support, but I have an active license. But if we could do that with our NGOs here in Lee County, because there are nonprofits because they serve. So there was a manpower shortage. So is there a way of calling that up tied to grant funding?
We did a little bit of that with Salus Care. So everyone knows the crisis unit was not open for many months, but yet they had staff. So some of our programs, we saw an increase in applications. And so we tapped into Salus Care, physically had them over in our conference room, processing applications for past due water, past due electric, because those folks, and we had this conversation even during COVID, when everything gets back to whatever our normalcy is, we're going to need those folks to be able to staff the CSU. And so the biggest fear is when something like that happens, do people then move on? And if we're already in a shortage of employment here in our community, the CSU gets back up and running, but they've got no one to work there. So we made sure to put those folks to work, still helping with our community to ensure they still got a paycheck. So they stayed local. So when CSU opened up, they could fully staff it and operate it. So I think some of that stuff happens organically, but we could probably be a little more intentional. And I'll kind of turn to Celeste about the seat at the table, because I don't know the best way to facilitate that from your standpoint when you have the different branches and the different seats and you have representation from different entities. What would that look like? Is that like facilitated by United Way since they're there already, or what options do you think are there?
It would depend. So we have the Economic Development Office seated. We have the Visitor and Convention Bureau seated. So my first question would be, are you interfacing with either one of those on a day-to-day basis? Because if you are, okay, then we have a seat for you already. It's just that we need to make sure that that communication is going where it needs to go. If you don't, and then there's an opportunity to create a new seat, because we're not about, excluding anyone from the party. If you really want to be part of that party, then we can look at who then is the best representative to sit in that seat. You would need possibly, I would say 3 people, a daytime person, a nighttime person, and then an alternate in case something happens. And then we would have to look and say, out of everyone, who's going to be the person, the 2 people, 3 people that you're going to rely on to make sure that they have the list of all of the contacts for your group and reach out to everyone and provide them all the information, and also bring information back to the EOC, because that's the input into us so that we understand what's going on. And that also means that they'll make connections in the EOC. It's a big networking opportunity. As Jennifer said, it's a high. We all have jobs, but we all work together and we cross over. So yes, you might be interfacing with the volunteers and donations branch so that you can help, because you're like, hey, we've got somebody over here that can provide you with some stuff. Or, is it more that you're providing us information because as many of your businesses or your organizations do, they affect our economic impact. So it may be more interfacing with economic development, things like that. So, and even Visitor and Convention Bureau, because tourism, that is a big economic driver for us, if not the top one. So there is a lot of ways that you can interface, but that is a conversation we would have to develop further. And from, I think, our perspective, we would have to have kind of who is the structure? Is there a structure for who's going to kind of lead this group? And from that, who then would be the representative? And so that's something that we would work through with you.
And those are, to add to that, great point, Celeste. I think that's where we're all going here. There's definitely a need or a want for, and I'll use the broad term, NGOs to be involved, right? So some of them are, there are a couple in there that have seats in the EOC, Salvation Army, Red Cross. There's clearly a lot more stakeholders than just those, right? So I think it's, and Celeste, it depends answer. That's an emergency management answer a lot. I've said it a lot, but she's right. It does. Not everyone, there's not going to be one person in charge of all NGOs and communicating with all NGOs, right? If you're a faith-based group, it may be different. If you're a healthcare NGO, you may fall under our health and medical branch at the EOC. If you're housing, you may fall under another, a chain. So I think, that that's where I think this group can really go to do that mapping exercise, to identify the stakeholders and figure out, and it may not be a seat, and I've been in that room a lot. When I walked in after Ian, I've never seen that many people in that building. It was unbelievable, the support that was there. So I think, there's obviously space limitations, but that doesn't mean there can't be connections somehow through that process, which is absolutely needed. So I think you're right. It depends. And now let's go back and figure out who the stakeholders are and try to map them into a process.
Dr. Martin?
I just want to quickly, if you didn't know this, I'll give you the information. I'll remind you, we had 16,000 students and every one of them is required to do 80 hours of public service as part of graduation. So in some respects, Ian was a gold mine. I mean, they were deeply involved. I ran into our baseball team, who I think did about twice that number, and they were coming back from Fort Myers Beach. And they said, we're the antithesis of Habitat for Humanity. We're tearing stuff out. And so they were all celebrating that they were giving, but there's a resource there that once tapped, at least in terms of person power, there's a lot of them. And we look for places for students to not only do service, but to learn something in the process. So just to know, there's a pretty good collection of folks who want to help.
When we had the tornadoes touchdown in South Fort Myers in January of last year, we tapped into FGCU, and a lot of your students from the social work program came and actually did a lot of front facing work with the folks that were impacted, and they were doing the assessments and escorting them from nonprofit to nonprofit. So I think there's probably pockets of things that people do, but at the larger level, we need to formalize that a little bit better.
Last thing I'll say, cross-pollination works, right? And to echo what, Dr. Martin is saying, reach out to your universities. Florida Gulf Coast and the University of Florida, for the first time since COVID, are now working collectively for statewide impact and even beyond. So let us help you be the conveyor as these things start, because there are invisible systems, politics, all of these things. Sometimes you might need a more neutral conveyor to start. And let's harness our future workforce and our academics and all of the science that we have available through these universities to make us more robust collectively, regionally.
All right. Well, we by no means have to go the full 2 hours here. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just a couple questions. My background's more healthcare, not so much in some of the other areas. And we're very used to running emergency management plans. That's how we're prepared. That's how we organize and stay really focused throughout an emergency or disaster. Are there requirements in place? So Celeste, this is kind of for you. Are there requirements for these types of plans for non-healthcare facilities?
No.
Okay.
So for, unless you are federally or state regulated and it is part of your licensure requirement, then you do not have a requirement for an emergency management plan or continuity of operation plan. Healthcare is very regulated, top to bottom and sideways some days. So yes, it is a requirement for healthcare. So it is proposed as a best management practice. You are better able to be resilient, to respond and to recover if you have a plan, and if your plan has been trained to your team and exercised. So I highly encourage it. I did bring some copies of the Smithsonian's program for the branch directors to look at, and it outlines not just for archives like theirs, but for others, and it also identifies resources. The website URL is on there. And there's also a document from FEMA discussing expanding mitigation to arts and culture specifically. So I brought some copies of that, because I think that what it sounds like is you're at that point where you're like, where do we go from here? How do we move forward? And so part of it is I think you definitely need to have a planning effort, and each of the organizations need a plan. And at a minimum, an emergency management plan, but if you can also incorporate into that a continuity of operations plan. So even if you have to operate from a different location, how do you continue to operate, provide the services that the community is expecting from you? And including paying your staff, making sure their healthcare is available, things like that. And also, when you do the mitigation process, you start to identify the areas where you have weaknesses that could be shored up, and that might open up some grant opportunities at that point. And the best thing about it is that once you have it documented, that starts to really help you move towards finding grant resources, because you actually have that document that shows them, we've done the homework and we know what we need.
Okay, no, that's very helpful because I think, you know, a lot of us have gone through this. We understand what it takes, the training, the documents, the formatting, different experiences that we've had that we try to incorporate in. And so I think there's a lot of lessons learned specifically on the healthcare side that could be maybe translated over. Also, are there resources or funding, or could this be a request on the resiliency side or the hardening of these types of facilities, and or going out and doing that assessment for some of the smaller ones that may not know exactly what to look for or what they need or what expertise may be out there, but to be able to get some good assessments of these facilities or these organizations, see how we could harden them. What would it take besides maybe just the top 3 things that they needed, you know, during a storm or after the storm to get out there? Because, you know, that's one thing that we're focused on right now. And how do you keep water out? You know, what can we do with our windows? What can we do just with parking, with vehicles, all of those types of things that we have some of that expertise on our team. Lee Health does, you know, but some of these smaller organizations may not. So maybe there's a funding mechanism or a resource to be able to tap into some of that to help facilitate. And then the third comment was just, I know once again, healthcare hat on, we report our bed capacity out, you know, almost was it twice a day, you know, during like before and during and through. So if somebody's looking for placement or they need to come from another area, we have that capacity to be able to take them in. Is there anything like that for resources in our community, whether it's capacity with meals, whether it's an surplus? Is that more of an EOC question, or how do resources move around the community during a time of need? Is there a way to go in and tap to see where those resources are so that a lot of that comes out of
a lot of that comes out of emergency management. We have kind of a network of the neighborhoods that we work with that we fund and do some work with, but I think at a larger scale, those resources, I think, more or less are deployed through emergency management and their operation.
So in emergency management, we have an entire section called logistics, and resources are exactly what they are involved in: getting them, deploying them, you know, finding them wherever they may be. And it goes beyond just the county, it's regional, it's statewide. And if we have to go outside the state, then we go through that process as well. And so with that, part of it is that when we're looking for the resources, it's the outreach. Who do we know that has resources? Can we get a hold of them? What do you have that's available? You know, and so it's a lot of that communication that occurs. And then once we identify, you know, someone that has those resources, then we're like, okay, we have the resources. Can we get them here at this time? Type of thing. We need this much of however many widgets that you have. So, and it can be personnel too. It is not just widgets. It can be, you know, property, like, you know, as Roger referred to earlier. Sometimes it's about the staging areas. We just need an empty lot so we can park semis that have the resources that we need to deploy. So it's things like that. Yeah. And, you know, temporary housing in the sense of like the people that come with those resources, could they come with their own base camps, but we need a big place to pop up that base camp. So there are a multitude of types of resources that we are looking for. And so we kind of, and it goes against something I have said before. I have told many people, especially in healthcare, we are not Amazon, but we look like Amazon during the situation because we are trying to find all of the resources for the community and then deploy them out to the community. So that is kind of like centralized what we do.
So does that happen through phone calls? Is it an app? Is it a website?
Emails. We have an incident management system called Web EOC that allows us to have communications directly with the state about resources and so forth. So any form of communication that is available and still working, depending on the disaster, we use it.
And I think there's There's some resources that are easier to track if it's coming directly through the county system. That's one thing, you know, we should have the county, I say the county should have ownership of that, that resource or that process. To use one example, feeding has been historically difficult to track because not all of that's coming through the Emergency Operations Center network, which is fine, right? We know there's a lot of great stuff happening, but I think there's probably other circumstances like that where historically it's been a little bit difficult to track, you know, how many meals are here, how many are here. Some larger NGOs have a process in place and are well coordinated through the EOC, and some, you know, just got into that business, right? Welcome to Southwest Florida. You know, so I think there's ways we can improve on that. We can improve that collaboration. Not that everything has to go through the same formal process, but it sure would be nice to have a better, you know, visibility and playing field of feeding, for example.
And that's a great example, Lee, because many people come from out of county and out of state because they just want to do the right thing and help people. And you don't know what you don't know. So some folks will just come in and say, where do I go? Sometimes they don't coordinate it through the county, which is great. And sometimes it is, but a lot of our NGOs will just set up their mobile food pantries based on hardest hit areas. But I remember being at the Lakes Park Disaster Recovery Center. 2 guys literally drove in from North Carolina with a box truck and they said, where can we bring these things? I called 3 or 4 different nonprofits and all of them turned it down because they said, we've got stuff, we've got this, but I'll take this and I'll take that. And I talked to the gentleman, I'm like, we're not going to piecemeal. We just want to bring it down and help people. So after making about 20 phone calls, finally found a nonprofit who was willing to take those items. Not because they didn't want to help people, but because there's so many resources coming down in the community. The nonprofit said, no, we're good on clothing. We're good on water. Give it to someone else who needs it. And so sometimes things just kind of, again, I hate to use the word again, but some things just kind of happen organically. And sometimes we hope it's all planned and structured because then you have the way of promoting that. And so I know this sounds terrible to say, but you know, the county put a bunch of stuff on the website. Well, if you don't have electricity or Wi-Fi, then you can't access it. Yep. You can edit that out, right? But we tried to put as much as we could on the website and do a lot of mapping of where all the food pantries were. Even now, with the school district out, all those maps exist of where people can go for the school spots. So it's great information, but it can only be shared if the EOC gets it to actually promote. And sometimes people just come in and do what they think is right that sometimes we don't even know about.
Roger, I wonder if right now we're doing a lot of warehousing through United Way.
Yeah.
Right. I think what we've got available as far as you can access and say, hey, there's a bed. So the community can, the donors can. I wonder if we can invert that in those times is outside of the area, they'll still have access to technology. So if we can say, hey, can you post what you have? And then we know who to go to and have it both ways. Right. It might be a great inventory place that United Way could host.
And this folds in really well with the conversation from this morning's workshop, where there's an inventory of all of the agencies, organizations, nonprofits, faith-based, whatever their structure, coalition even, of what they experienced insofar as activation and understanding what they feel their, not just their capacity, but even whether or not they want to do it again. So we had a very frank dialogue about that. And Ben Avis has a lot of notes. So we're very much looking forward to following up on that on the other side of all of this. But I think that we would be remiss if we didn't fold that in all together. And Roger, I love the idea of the universal application where all of this could be streamlined, but also regionalized because those partnerships are being built currently.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I would love for the EOC to have one centralized way. I know that's how out on Santa Monica Captiva we got the majority of our assets because contrary to some areas served, there wasn't the notion that Sanibel and Captiva had a big need just because of the makeup. So I have to say thank you so much to our partners, like for example, Harlem Heights, who was getting buses and buses of things that we were not getting just because when people think of Sanibel Captiva, they don't think of that need where they were kind of saying, well, we have an abundance of things. Can we get you some of your needs taken care of? And of course, the EOC, the immediate relief needs, ice, water, comfort stations. I think that sort of process and getting it a little bit more streamlined for all things, not just the immediate relief efforts of a makeup of a comfort station is important to make sure that all communities get what they need post-disaster.
Okay.
To follow up
Oh.
on, Troy, he chairs our Health and Social Services branch. And this, you brought forward a discussion we really got into, which we know the role of the EOC, the Amazon role and whatever, and we know everybody was sourcing the items they need. But to Maria's point, right after, a couple of days later, Roger's point, all these NGOs coming in, I didn't know where to send them. My phone was ringing off the hook at Lee County Homeless Coalition. And the people that were feeding at the Broadway Palm, no one was showing up. So there is a need for, and we were asking for it in our branch, for some type of a mechanism to, first of all, accept the help, the social services help from other agencies, but then see that they're being deployed to where they need to be deployed. We all have stories of people that have passed away because they weren't touched.
Well,
So,
and it's a great point, and I
but
think
where does it sit?
deciding who is the repository for that, because also, part of Future Makers, we were in the school district. It was a catastrophe with people bringing stuff to the school district. They had nowhere to put it, but people were bringing, everything to the school district, and they're like doing other things, right? So figuring out how can we get the word out about where's the place.
I would say, well, one thing that helped out with us, because we're a church, we have over 100 members on staff. So we were able to pivot to over 100 people helping, plus our volunteers. And one of the biggest obstacles was communication. We had no internet. And so we're back here, all these NGOs are coming in. I'm getting 5 phone calls every 60 seconds. And so what we had to, we have a big enough team where our senior pastor, executive pastor went to Orlando just to have internet to make the phone calls, to operate as like the owners of a football team, make the play for us that were on the ground here, say, hey, run this play. And we finally figured out that, okay, let's get Starlink down here. We got Starlink in the midst of all this crazy chaos, started using that. I think having these hubs or these hives or, of different places where we could let the community know before, hey, if you lose power, here's where you can go to find out where you can get help. Here's internet access, and have these little hubs of just internet, because that's just huge. I mean, wars have been lost because of communication.
Yep.
And I think just having that internet, I'm sure that's been thought of, but
Yeah.
I just thought I'd give a real life example.
Yeah. So any other comments here? Because I do need to move to public comment. Did you have anything final?
I'll just add to that. The county is working with Lee Health and a bunch of other stakeholders with DEO on a whole broadband program. And if whatever that looks like, we've talked about, they've done, the tests of where the speed is in the community. And there's been conversations of, do you have a mobile unit that is a mobile Wi-Fi hotspot into a community? Do you create these kind of telehealth and telemedicine hubs in the rest of Lee County so people who can't access it can? So at a bigger scale, there is a conversation about building a better broadband system here.
Other final comments from the branch?
I just had a really bizarre situation happen at our museum. That was sort of the opposite of that, is we were not communicated with at all. And all of a sudden, because we sit on a public park, we had people that were camping. So we were open to the public. Luckily, we did not have very much damage and were able to open within a few weeks. And all of a sudden there was all these people camping behind the museum. And we, the first night we're like, who are these people? What are they here for? And it turned out that they were a church group or something that was looking, and they had coordinated with the city, but the city didn't let us know. So, our big fears were like, okay, well, we are a building that has security issues, and these people are right in our backyard. And what happens if our building burns down? Or, there were things like that. So on the opposite side of that, we weren't communicated with at all. And yet they were utilizing our space. So it goes both ways.
Okay, thank you. So, I do think we got a lot of really good ideas and initiatives out of this. We have a good list. You did a great job. You covered a lot. If you have other ideas for initiatives, you can scan the QR code and fill out a form. Anyone can fill those out. Things that popped up from this, anything you think of later, things that we might not have gotten to. So don't forget to do that. And so now I'm going to see if there's any public comment. Oh, surprise. Why don't you sit up front?
Hi, I'm Betsy and I'm with I'm the coordinator of the Immigration Network. And I really like what Roger said about standardizing things. And I will tell you that having been a nonprofit for a very long period of time, unless there is an incentive, and that may be funding or whatever, the emergency plan is not going to happen. I have pulled teeth. Staff don't have the time and the board could care less. So there needs to be an incentive, number one. Training as to what it means, so it's consistent, so you have the same answers. And then whether you're tying it to funding or incentive or whatever, I think is really critical there. And the other thing is, if you have staff available, but your museum isn't open, are they trained to know how to move into other areas, just like Roger said, so you don't lose those staff? So cross-training and emergency preparedness or long-term would be helpful.
Great, thank you. And that goes back to that capacity. We have to think about that in a real way. All right, any other comments from the public? Okay. All right, we did it. Congratulations. We'll break, and I think we have our last workshop today at 2:30. 2:30. All right. So thank you, everybody. Let's give our panel a round of applause, and we'll see you back here in a little bit.